G'day there, you're watching the Aussie BIM Guru, and today I'm making a video about making a document transmittal in Revit using Dynamo. So today we'll be getting all the sheets in a Revit model and processing their revisions and those revisions numbering sequences to get the specific characters to that date or revision, and also to that sheet and how many times that revisioning sequence has been used. We'll finally take this and copy it into a tab separated values string and copy that into Excel. So it's going to look a little bit like this. I do have a template file I'll be using, but you could just copy it into an empty Excel file and then format it to suit. But as you can see, each sheet is going to have date specific and sheet specific indices of revisions, and some of them will occur at different positions. So these are going to be sheet specific numbering sequences. In this case, I do have an old video on this topic, but really all I did was just mark the sheets and dates with X's. I didn't use any Python, so there was a little bit more scripting involved. And in this case, I didn't really process different sequence types. So you're going to learn a fair bit about revisions and revision numbering sequences in the Revit API. So I'll be using Revit and Dynamo and Python and a little bit of the Crumple package just to get the script started and finished, but mostly working with Python. So whilst you won't need all of the skills I show today to learn about them, it will help if you have basic Python fundamentals and a good grasp of methods, properties, and enumerations in the Revit API. If you're a little bit behind on some of this stuff, I do recommend checking out some of my more fundamental videos on these topics, because Python isn't something I typically recommend you rush, because you probably will learn less in the process through rushing. So let's jump in. As always, if you find I'm talking too fast, you can slow me down, or if I'm talking too slow, you can speed me up using the YouTube playback speed. But without further ado, let's get started. So I set up a project here to use for testing, and this contains a variety of revision sequence types. So it's worth being aware that since Revit 2021, I believe they added it, if not 2022, that we can now create not just numeric and alphanumeric sequences, but also custom sequences as well, which technically behave as alphanumeric sequences typically, unless you specify otherwise. So if I go to numbering systems, I can go alphanumeric, which of course supports both a prefix and a suffix, as well as characters. Whereas a numeric sequence is usually a little bit more complex because it has the option for minimum numbers of digits, as well as starting numbers, then prefixes and suffixes, but instead it just climbs numerically. For custom series, you can, in this case, I believe, might be able to specify alphanumeric when you first create one. And you can create new sequence names, but effectively all series are either alphanumeric or numeric in nature, but some can be custom in addition to the two defaults that come with Revit, which, as you can see, by default typically can't be deleted. Now I've also created a C and a P series here. The only difference they have is they have a prefix in this case, either a P or a C for the prefix. So we're going to want to be able to pick up any of these four revision sequencing systems. So noting in this case, I've just put them in the order of numeric, alpha, P, and C, and just given them some placeholder date and description names. It's worth being aware I'm working with revisions per sheet in this project, in this workflow. Working per project is probably a little bit more simple because the sequence is always set, regardless of the order of how many of them appear on a particular sheet. So per sheet is what we'll work with here. And we can see as a result, the first time certain revisions appear, they will use the first available character in the sequence. So we can see all the n revisions here go 1, 2, 3, but if we go to a more complex set of revisions, such as this one here, we can see we've got one numeric revision, which is O1, two alphas, which are AB, two Ps, which are P1, P2, and one C, which is C1. But if I, of course, add a secondary numeric one, it's going to, in this case, account for both the sequence of the revisions, but also it will uptick or downtick the number, depending on how many have already appeared. So we're going to be looking at the revision numbering sequences, as well as the revisions themselves, when we're trying to determine what this character should be in relation to the sheet, because by default, Revit, I believe, doesn't really give us access to this information about the sheet specificity of the revision. So we're going to use a more complex process to work with these. So in this case, I'm going to open Dynamo in this case, and I'm just going to firstly collect my sheets. Now I'm going to use a custom node from Crumple for this, collect sheets. And I'm also in this case going to get all the sheet numbers because I just want to sort my sheets by sheet number first because they might be out of order. So we currently should have our sheets. I'm going to say that I don't want to include placeholder sheets, which is why I'm using this custom node. I can exclude them that way. And then I'm also going to sort those sheets by key, with the key being the alphanumerical value of the sheet. Now in this case I did create them in order, so they're going to come in order, but in this case we just want to get our sheets in order. And this is so that when we have a document transmittal, they actually read in order in the document transmittal. So collect sheets and sort by number. So at this point, we're going to go straight into a Python block. So I'm going to be using my boilerplate here, which you can find on my GitHub, but I am going to be stripping it back quite a lot. So I'm going to take out a majority of the things in my actual boilerplate. So if you want to recreate it, it's not going to be too hard. So I'm basically only keeping, in this case, I think Revit services and the common language runtime. I don't need transactions, and I do need the Revit API, so I am going to keep the API reference and also the imports related to it, and I'm also going to keep the current document reference. But otherwise, this is effectively what we would call our boilerplate. So we have in this case doc as the current document as a variable we can use later. I am also going to keep a function here, the unwrap list function. So this will allow me to access sheets in the form of a list. If they're not a list, it will make them into a list. This is to force a single object to become what we call an iterable, or allow it to be looped through in Python. So I'm going to, in this case, say that my sheets, and I'll just call this sheets as a variable, is an unwrapped list. So it's unwrapping the result and also making it a list if it's not currently a list. Now at the moment it is a list, so all it's going to do is unwrap the element for us to work with. From this point, we're really dealing with custom code. So to begin with, we're going to be using a filtered element collector to collect all the revision numbering sequences in the project. So these sequences I showed you before, numeric, alphanumeric, P series, C series, are actually a separate class in the Revit API to revisions themselves. So we're just going to collect revisions and sequences. So if you haven't seen a filtered element collector before, we have to use them a little bit on the channel, but effectively we call on the class in the Revit API, the filtered element collector, and we're going to apply it to the current document. And we're going to use the of class argument, and the name of the class we're targeting here is revision numbering with caps on the front of each word, sequence. And you can also, I believe it's probably redundant here, but you can say to elements, and we can pass this to our out variable to visualize what we're actually dealing with at the moment. And we should find that we get these four numeric, alphanumeric, P series, C series objects. We also want to get all the revisions in the project in the order of their sequence as well. So whilst we could use a filtered element collector to get all our revisions, it's a little bit risky because they're not going to be in the sequence order of the project. But if we go to the revision class, just some music I was listening to there, and we go to, I believe, methods, and we use the get all revision IDs method, we can actually apply this to the base revision class to get all the documents revisions in the order of the sequence number, which is a really good time saver. It's going to return them as element IDs, so I am going to store this to a variable that I'm going to call rev IDs. And in this case, we call on the revision base class because we're creating an object. And I'm going to apply it to the current document. And this should now give us a list of element IDs, which we can turn into revisions quite easily. So I'm just going to store a variable called revs for revisions. I'm going to do basically a list comprehension here. So we're going to create a list using a statement. So you do need to use the list symbol or the closed bracket. And I'm going to use the document.getElement method, which requires an element ID, which I'm going to refer to as I for I in rev IDs. And this will take those rev IDs and effectively turn them into revisions. So this is a pretty specific syntax in Python. It's effectively the same thing as saying for I in rev IDs, and then creating an empty list container object, and then saying revs append doc get element I. But the benefit of doing this is you first of all, don't have to declare your object as an empty list, and you also don't need 2 lines to write a for loop for a very simple function. So sometimes the list comprehension is pretty good. I try to avoid them when they get very complex and deep, but for something like this, they're really great. So we're going to use list comprehension now. We're now going to go through our revision numbering sequences and try to get their characters as well as their name. And then we can use that later on when we're looking at our sheets to say which revisioning numbering sequence we're dealing with, and then index it and get the relevant character by how many times we've seen that sequence in its overall set of revisions. So it's a little bit of a complex workflow, but it will hopefully make sense as we go further along. So I'm just going to say that we're making some empty lists to store to for the revision numbering sequences, and I'm going to call this revision sequence names and revision characters of sequences. So in this case, I'm just going to make these 2 variables. You can do that in Python. You can store 2 variables at once by making sure you have 2 arguments on either side of the bracket. So in this case, we have 2 variables and then 2 declared values. So I'm now going to work, I'm going to get the characters of my sequences. So in this case, I'm going to say for R in revisions. So we're going to go through each revision one at a time and get its character sequence. I'm firstly going to get the sequence from the revision. So if I go to my revision class, I'll find that if I go to its properties, I can ask for the revision numbering sequence ID. And as we did before with an ID, you can use the document get element method in order to get the object itself. So it's a little bit of an indirect route to get to the revisioning numbering sequence. But in this case, I'm just going to say RSID, or revisioning sequence ID, is equal to R. I'm going to use that revision numbering sequence ID property. I'm now going to say the revisioning sequence itself is doc get element RSID. So we now have both the revisioning sequence as well as its ID as objects. I'm now going to append the name to the name sequence because we're going to want to check later on what is the sequence we're dealing with. And I'm also going to create an empty list to start appending characters to build the character sequence for this sequence itself. So in this case, I'm going to say revisioning sequence names append, and in this case, I'm going to append the revisioning sequence's name to this list. As well as this, I'm then going to go to character sequence. And in this case, we're going to make an empty character sequence. And then as well as this, the next step is we actually want to work through our sequence characters to find out the character sequence for this particular revision. So in this case, I'm going to get sequence characters. And we're going to firstly have to check if we're dealing with a numeric or an alphanumeric sequence. I'm going to get the sequence characters if it's numeric first. So we can do this by looking at the revisioning numbering sequence class. And we'll see that there are some properties in this case and also some methods. So we can use the, I think in this case, we check if it's numeric using the number type property. So this will tell us if the revisioning sequence is numeric or not. So in this case, it will return, I believe in this case, a enumerated value or an enum. The revision number type enum. So we can see here we do have the option for none if it has none applied. We're assuming all revisions at least have a sequence applied to them, but we'll either have numeric or alphanumeric types. So what I'm going to do here is say if the revisioning sequence's number type property, and with an enumeration, we firstly say the name of the enumeration first, revision number type, and then we append on the name or the type of enumeration. And we're checking if it's numeric. So if it is, we're going to begin by getting the settings for the revisioning numbering sequence. So if we go to the revision numbering sequence, and I believe in this case we need to get its settings, which we can do using the get numeric settings. So this is why we need to know if it's alphanumeric or numeric. This will give us access to the numeric revision settings class or object associated with these. So we'll just have a quick look at them. And they're fairly simple. So in this case, they have some properties such as the minimum digits, the prefix, the start number, and the suffix. As well as this, we also, in the alphanumeric settings, have access to the prefix and the suffix, which is obviously much more simple because the alphanumeric sequence is much more straightforward. As well as this, I believe that we can also get the actual alphanumeric sequence as a list. So we can actually ask for it. Now, numeric's a little bit different. It doesn't give us access, I believe, to the sequence. So we can see there's no get sequence, but we know that numeric sequence will start at the start number to a certain degree with a prefix and a suffix. So we can process them still. So in this case, I'm going to say that settings is equal to the get numeric revision settings method. So at this point, I now have that object related to this object. So I say settings is equal to that. Now that I have the settings object, I can say the minimum digits is equal to settings. And then in this case, I can use the minimum digits property of that particular object. As well as this, I can get the prefix. And I can also get the suffix. Noting that if we did just use either alphanumeric or numeric, it would actually break because there is no minimum digits or sequence property for a numeric sequence, or there's no sequence available as a method for the numeric settings. So we have to make sure we process these in two separate paths, if that makes sense. From here, I can now say for n, and we're going to make a range. We're going to start our range at the settings start number. And I'm just going to finish at a fairly high number, something like 99, just under the assumption we're probably never going to have more than 99 of these. If you know you're going to have more, just go higher, go to like 999 or something larger. You could also check how many revisions in your project have this particular number sequence applied to them first. And then you could also set the limit to the number of those plus the minimum digit number, but I'd say just picking a fairly high number is quite safe. But as we go through the sequence, we're going to want to build up our actual character sequence. So because these are numeric, the first thing we're going to do is turn the character into a string. So I'm going to call this a character string, and we're going to use this str option here. So we're going to transform n into a string from a number. I'm also going to pad my string because we do have a minimum digits limit in this case. So we will need to make sure it's the minimum number of digits wide. To do this, I'm going to use the rjust method, which in this case we apply to our string. So we're going to use rjust, and in this case to rjust, we're going to firstly specify the minimum digits and then what we want to fill the particular string with. There are other methods there. I believe there's one called zfill as well that you can use, but I find that one's a pretty stable one to use. Now we want to say that our next character in the sequence or character sequence is going to be the prefix plus that character we've just generated plus suffix. And finally, we can then append this to the character sequence that we've created originally for this specific revision. So there we go. We now have effectively a mechanism for creating our numeric sequence. But of course, we also want to get sequence for alphanumeric, because now we have the else condition that we can use, because we know otherwise it should be an alphanumeric sequence. So again, we're going to collect, so we're going to use else, and we're now going to say settings is equal to rs get alphanumeric revision settings. And now we're going to pretty much go through, I'm just going to copy and paste a few things because we're getting the prefix, we're also getting the suffix. Now, instead of getting a numeric sequence now, we can actually get the sequence as a method, as we saw before. So I'm going to say for a in settings, and then we're going to apply the get sequence method. And we're going to say that, first of all, character sequence. So we can actually probably borrow this. Character sequence is equal to prefix plus a plus suffix. And then we can also just append our character sequence at that particular point. And I believe the last thing we have to do at this point is then apply the actual total character sequence to our list of character sequences. So we want to take our Revit character sequence. So I'll just make a comment here. And we can say now rev character sequences append character sequence. So if we access our Revit revision character sequences at this point, hopefully I've made no typos. There we go. We can see we've got our numeric setting with C, numeric with P, and we've got our alpha, which has no prefix at the moment. And then we have our numeric setting as well. So we should have in this case 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 character sequences for 12 revisions at this point. So now we're going to actually look at the revisions applied to the sheets and check what character should be used for its corresponding revisioning numbering sequence. And as we work through them, we'll figure out effectively what the actual character in Revit should be based on how many times we've used that revision with a particular character sequence already. So in this case, we're going to actually also start building a little piece of text that we can copy into an Excel file instead of a list of objects. It's a little bit of a shortcut here. It's up to you whether you want to append these to lists, but in my case, I'm going to be using a bit of a different process. So we're going to get revisions per sheet, and I'm also just going to say, first of all, that our rows out is an empty list. We're going to want to basically just write rows of data to put into our document transmittal. And I'm going to specify a separator as a tab in this case, which you can do with the \T. In this case, this is what you would call an escape character. It's a special syntax in Python that tells this piece of object you are a tab, because you can't type a tab in there as far as I know. So we're going to now say for S in sheets. And in this case, we're going to be getting all the revisions of the sheet. So if we check the sheet class in Revit, which is the view sheet class, there's a method available to get all the revision IDs of that sheet. So we should have the get all revision IDs method. And we can use this to determine which revisions with sequences are available to this sheet and work through them. I'm going to say in this case, first of all, we actually need to track the revisions that we've already seen in the sheet, because we are going to need to know how many times we've seen a particular numbering sequence get used and then know which character we should have based on that from that particular sequence. So if we see it twice, we know we need to get the second character in the sequence, for example. I'm now just going to store these sheet revisions to a variable called sheet revs. And then now that we have these, first of all, I can just append nothing to row out for now. So we're going to create an empty string to begin with. And then first of all, I want to have my sheet number and my sheet name on that particular row. So I'm going to say row out. I'm going to use the plus equals argument in Python, which is effectively going to append a string to the string. So I'm going to say S sheet number plus separator plus the sheet name. So we're adding tabs between these, and then plus separator. So we're effectively writing a tab separated row at the moment. Now we want to check for each revision in the document if it belongs to the sheet. And we're going to work through each revision because effectively each column of our document transmittal is going to be each revision. So even if the sheet doesn't have the revision, we do want to identify when that happens, even if the sheet doesn't have it. I'm just going to make a little bit more space here. So in this case, I'm going to say for I in rev IDs. So we're going all the way back and getting this original variable for all the revisions in the document in the sequence order. And we're firstly going to check is this revision on the sheet? Does sheet have revision? So we're going to say if I is in sheet revs, then we're going to want to go and check the sequence character that is applied to this object. So we're going to begin for processing the sequence. So I'm going to say in this case that our revision is now going to become an object. So we're going to use the doc get element argument. So for the current revision that we found in our sheet revisions, we're going to get that actual revision. And then we're going to get its revisioning sequence numbering ID. So we're doing a little bit of repetition here, some things we've already done before. And then we're also in this case going to need to get the revisioning sequence number itself. So again, we're going to use the RS ID as the argument. And then we're also just going to check what is the name of the revisioning sequence. And we can now identify based on our original two lists which revisioning sequence character set we need to work with. So we know in this case we have a revision. So now we need to find the index of the name of sequence. So I can say I underscore SQ. And in this case, I'm just finding the index from the revisioning sequence names. I'm going to ask for the index of the revision sequencing name that we're dealing with here. From here, I can then actually say how many times have we added this name to our tracking revision here, which is effectively what we're using to check which index of the character of the sequence of the revisioning number we want to access. So in this case, by default, we're obviously going to have no occurrences until we append it to that tracking object. So at the moment, we're going to be indexing the character sequence at the number of 0, which, as you know, is the first object in the character sequence. So for now, I'm going to say that the index of the character we're dealing with is going to be equal to the trackRevs object. And we're going to use the count method to count how many times that name occurs in this list, which is currently 0. In this case, we can now get the character using these indices. So we can say get the character. We can say in this case that the character, which I'll just call D in this case, is going to be equal to the revision character sequences, which we know are currently set up as a list of lists of character sequences. First of all, we're going to index twice. So our first indice that we're accessing is going to be the sequence that we know we're dealing with. So we're going to use i.sq. And once we have this sequence, now we want to know which character in the sequence to use. And we know this based on the count of how many times we're going to track this sequence. So I can now say i.ch. We can then also add a separator to go to the next column in the sequence. And then we can also just take our trackRevs object, which is how we're counting how many times we've seen the revision, and just append the revision sequencing name to this object. So next time we see it, it's going to get a count of 1, and then we're going to access the second object in that character sequence. So it's a little bit of a complex workflow, but a fairly quick one. Counting and indexing is a very quick process, so it's pretty efficient. Now this is what we've done if we happen to have found that that revision is in the sheet revisions. Otherwise, we're going to want to append something blank. So I'm going to say else. And in this case, we just want to say that D or data is equal to nothing plus the separator. And now that we have, in this case, this piece of data, we can append it to our row which we're writing currently. And then at the end, we can then say to rows out, the overall list of object, we can append row out. And if we just take rows out, then I believe that's it. We haven't got a header on this at the moment, so we might add that as well. Okay, I've got a typo, get all revision IDs. Where have I got? Oh, IDs, it's a method, of course. Another typo. I need to apply that to the sheet. There we go. So we can see we've started to find these actual characters as they occur to the sheet and started to write effectively the rows of a tab separated value file. The last thing we want to do is actually just add a header to the top so that when we copy this into our document transmittal, it just writes the whole set of contents. So in this case, our header is going to have a few things. So I'm going to say my header is equal to, and first of all, the first column will be sheet number as a string, plus separator, plus sheet name. So I need to do a plus there, plus separator. And now in this case, we're going to need to take all the names of the revisions and then make those the column headers in this case, or the date. It's up to you. We'll do date in this case actually, because if you get a revision object in the Revit API, you can ask for its date property. So once it pops up on the properties, we should be able to ask for the revision date, but you could use the revision name, you could use the date plus the name. It's up to you what you want those headers of your columns to read as. For now, I'll just do the date. So I'm going to use in this case a joined string in order to just take these all at once and put them all together. So I'm going to use the separator and I'm going to use the join method, I believe this would be called in this case. And we're going to get, again, using list comprehension, the revision date for each revision for R in revs. And in this case, I think we need to close the bracket as well. So what this is going to do is take every revision date and then separate it with a tab. So it's a little bit of a shortcut here. We could do this in another line of code to keep it cleaner, but it should be okay. I'm now just going to add the separator on the end in case anyone wants to add more stuff to this later. And I might just add a comment here and say make the header. And finally, of course, we need to actually add our header to our list of data. So to do this, we can insert the object into our rows out list. So I'm going to say rows out, and I'm going to use the insert method here, and I'm going to say at index 0, I want to add my header. And we should now, revision object has no attribute, revision, date. I did revision data. And expected string, I got a list, row 95. Okay, I've done something here again. What have I done here? I made a typo here somewhere, so just bear with me. Plus separator, join, r.revision date for r in revs. Interesting. I might just double check what's going on here. And just see what this looks like. Yeah, so we have a list of dates, as we'd expect. Just to keep things simple, I might put this into a separate row and just call this dates. And then I might try doing the separator join. I've used the capital join. I need to use the lowercase join method. There we go. So now we can see our headers have been joined with tabs at the top. Now at this point, you're probably thinking this isn't very useful. It's not very well structured as data, but really we're just going to copy this to our clipboard so that we can copy this into Excel as native TSV. You could obviously write this to an Excel file. You could track objects through here instead of text. It's up to you. In my case, I've just used I guess a big set of strings. So I'm going to close this block of Python, and we're just going to join, in this case, all of these together. So I'm going to use the string join node, and we're just going to join them with blank empty lines. So to all these strings, I'm going to join them using a enter. And this will generate basically a big string, which we can then copy to clipboard. So I'm going to use the clipboard send node from Crumple just to copy this string to my clipboard. So when I run, in this case, it's going to copy to my clipboard. And then in my document transmittal, I can just paste. And we can see very quickly we've just generated a document transmittal perfectly. So we can see we've got our numeric revisions, our alphanumeric revisions, our P's, our C's. We've got a mixture here occurring. We've got more mixtures. So we can see it's successfully managed to find the correct sequence numbering ID to apply in each case. So we can see here the first time that a P was used was on date 8, but on date 7 it was P01, and we can see it's P01 both times. So effectively, our workflow has been successful. You could, of course, write to Excel natively if you want to. It's a little bit more complicated, so my preference is usually just to create a block of text to paste in instead. I think at the moment all my sheets are just called unnamed. Yes, they are, but otherwise that would show their actual sheet name. But there we go. So a little bit of complex Python there. But hopefully it's been simple enough to follow if you have a base understanding of Python and looping in particular. And hopefully it's taught you a bit more about working with objects and the Revit API. So there we go, quite a deep dive into revisions and revision numbering sequences and the Revit API. Hopefully you kept up. If not, the script is available on my GitHub with all my other stuff. So feel free to download it there to help your learning journey. So thanks for watching today. If you have any requests, you can leave them down below or contact me at this email. And of course, like, comment, share, subscribe, whatever you can to help the channel so that we can help more people in the industry get better at using the tools and the processes. So thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in future similar videos. Thanks. Take care. Bye.